So my new title is Bite Your Tongue, you always need the colon. The tragic nature of taming of the shrew and female silencing in 16th century England. Of course, this is tentative, always. And before I begin, I just quickly, just for brevity's sake, I didn't know exactly how formal this needed to be, but when I make historical statements or anything, I just want to quickly cite the secondary sources that I use, so just to give the credit where it's due. Half Humankind, Context and Text of the Controversy About Women in England, 1540 to 1640, by Catherine Usher Henderson and Barbara F. McManus. Chaste, Silent, and Obedient by Suzanne Hall. And Tudor Women, Commoners, and Queens, Pearl Hogarth. Those were the texts that really helped me a lot. But to start my discussion of Taming of the Shrew, I want to give a quote from Sir Arthur Quiller Couch, which is from his introduction to the Cambridge edition of Taming of the Shrew from 1962. And it's pretty hyperbolic. So he says, "To call the Shrew a masterpiece is not only to bend criticism and to sick fancy, and to fawning upon Shakespeare's name, it does worse, accepted it sinks our standard of judgment, levels it, and by leveling forbids our understanding of how great genius operates, how consummate it can be at its best, how flagrantly bad at its worst."
Hold on. You're not thinking as fast as you are.
Okay, sorry. I think this is an interesting, this is kind of how you see how the play is regarded in scholarship a lot of the time. Part of this, I think, may have to do with the fact that it comes from the taming or shaming tradition of storytelling that was really popular in 16th century England. This popularity to modern day audiences and critics alike is rather distasteful and pretty discomforting. Two popular taming and shaming stories believed to have heavily influenced Shakespeare's play are A Merry Jest of a Shrewd and Cursed Wife Lapped in Moral Skin for Her Good Behavior, written in 1550, and A Pleasant Conceited History called The Taming of a Shrew, written in 1594, and they were both anonymously written. So I'll be referring specifically to the differences between the shrew and a shrew to illustrate that the nature of Shakespeare's play, to me, is more nuanced. The play, to be sure, is slightly troubling for modern audiences. Several critics have tried to reclaim the final speech by Catherine, who I will be referring to as Catherine because she's given the name Kate by Petruchio. So many people have tried to reclaim the final speech by her as being ironic and given with a tongue-in-cheek. And Harold Bloom is one of these critics who adheres to this reading. However, for the purposes of my thesis, I find that the ending is not at all ironic, but rather evidence of the ultimate silencing of Catherine. Thus, the play indicates that a taming is really larger historical context. The Taming of the Shrew really, for me, proves to be a culmination of these 16th century contexts that were so focused on female nature and female identity. But these contexts really appear, for me, within the margins of the play. Just saying a little bit more about the references I'll be making. I will be mentioning Jane Anger's pamphlet, Her Protection for Women, written in 1588. Jane Anger was the first English woman to enter into the female controversy dialogue that really was so popular throughout the 16th century, and I see a lot of similarities between her and Catherine. I will also briefly mention Edward Gosenhill's two pamphlets, one considered an attack on women, called The Schoolhouse for Women, written in 1541, and the other, A Defense Mulierum Paean, written in 1542. The male voices in the play really echo the sentiment seen in both the attacks and defenses that were used in female controversy pamphlets. And Gosenhill's will just serve as my examples, but just know that it's an example that exemplifies a lot of the attacks and defenses that were written throughout the century. And lastly, I will refer to the Elizabethan homily on matrimony, which was written in 1563, as this was most likely read at most wedding ceremonies, and it's essential to understanding the wedding scene in the play. So first, I want to talk about Catherine's anger. I think we all read the play and understand her to be a very angry character. She lashes out a lot. And I want to try and understand that. I think there's a reason why she's angry. And it's interesting because before she even speaks, she's introduced in a certain manner, and also Shakespeare really alludes to the shaming and taming traditions of the 16th century. So her father, Baptista, is talking about how he will not let his younger daughter, Bianca, marry until Catherine marries. And Gremio, who is a suitor of Bianca, says, he says to cart her rather, to cart Catherine, cart being a punishment exhibited in the streets. So that woman had to deal with. She's too rough for me. And so this is before Kate even speaks. And Kate, her first line is, I pray you, sir, is it your will to make a stale of me amongst these means? Which I think is and this is her talking to her father, because her father is essentially bartering with these men in terms of like how he's going to offer marriage with his daughter. So it's a very much a commodified system. And her first words really proved to be an apt criticism of the entire marriage process. I mean, women are completely commodified in this similar way that whores are, because she calls to make a stale of me being a whore. So that the metaphor is really not at all far-fetched, and her voice is understandably accusatory. So I just think that that definition of her is really important, that before we even hear her voice, she's already defined in these confines. So later, we see her enact violence against her sister. And this particular scene is so important because it ends with her saying to her sister, or to her father, concerning her sister Bianca, her silence flouts me and I'll be revenged. And I think that is so important because silence is kind of considered to be a staple feminine virtue of this time, and Bianca emanates that throughout the play, and she's lauded for that. And I think her anger really seems to be enacted against this divine virtue and the confinement that such a virtue really imposes on women. I think also really important to understanding her anger, I think this is a really interesting scene to me, because I think what's really important about understanding Catherine is a lot of people read it and they think, well, there's really no reason for her to be acting so violently. Like there's no rational behind it. But I think that there is, and one thing, there's a violent reaction she has, I think, it really is a violent reaction towards female education and towards the confines of female education, and this occurs when she's being taught how to play the lute, and she takes the lute and hits it over the teacher's head. And, which, is interesting, but it's hard, it's important to understand what female education really entailed at that time. And in the play, Baptista refers to in music, instruments, and poetry as the female education that he has for his daughters. And I mean, it's in noble women's education was generally limited to learning to read and write English, to learn to play an instrument, learn French, maybe Latin. But it's important to know that this was all done for the purpose of becoming better wife material. Even women who were lucky enough, like Sir Thomas More's daughters, to get a full-blown classical education, they got one for the purpose of becoming better wives to noblemen. If you were a noblewoman, you'd probably marry a nobleman and be expected to host guests who may be from another country, and if you could speak Latin or were able to aptly entertain this guest through music or otherwise, you would make your husband look really good. So the education had a specific purpose, and the specific purpose becomes more explicit within the play when Bianca is actually being taught Latin, or the classics. And rather than actually learning the language, there's a back and forth between her and Lucentio, where Lucentio is reading to her, and he says, hic avet, as I told you before, c'est moi. So he's reading to her, and then saying what he wants to say to her. I am Lucentio, hic est, son unto Vincentio, of Pisa, Sigia, Tellus, disguised thus to get your love. And so he's saying all these things to woo her, and she kind of responds, also reading along, but in between these words, she's stating her response to that attempt